All right. So we've kind of talked through this really good in terms of identifying whether it's an annual, a biennial, or a perennial. Just make sure you know that before you go to attack the weed and cause yourself more problems. Some other devices weeds have, they have rapid root growth. They have the seed banking ability, chemical warfare. So a good example of this is Russian knapweed. Russian knapweed it's an allelopathic plant. So once it gets established, it sends out this chemical that kills all the other plants around it and creates a monoculture. So if you get Russian knapweed really established, and you'd really only probably see it here in either abandoned cropland or maybe vacant lots or something that could get established, any disturbed soil sites. But it becomes a monoculture because it kills everything else around it. So that's, some neat strategies weeds have to outcompete. The other one that's not up here that has quite a few strategies it's developed over time is cheatgrass. Cheatgrass comes up earlier than anything else and gets the water and nutrients out of the environment and outcompetes things that way. The other thing that cheatgrass does better than any other plant is it adapts to weather conditions. So if you have a hot, dry summer with not much moisture, you'll see cheatgrass out there that's gotten 2 to 3 inches tall and gone to seed and reproduced. And if you have a really wet summer, you'll see cheatgrass that's 12 to 18 inches tall and then goes to seed and reproduce. So it's a master of adapting to the conditions that's given and outcompeting other plants because of that. So in terms of managing our weeds, prevention can be a big tool. Be careful when you bring in topsoil. It can have weeds in it or any other material. I told you I created a dry stream bed. I actually put weed barrier down because I thought, I don't want to fight weeds in this dry stream bed. I'll just put weed barrier down and then put rock in there. And so I put, I got river rock, big river rock, and put in there. But there was enough sand and silt in that river rock that I've fought weeds on top of my weed barrier the last 4 or 5 years. So, it's you never know what you're going to bring in. Manure, it's best to buy either composted manure or aged manure, and it needs to be hot enough compost so that it will kill the weed seed, because about 70% of our weed seeds can pass through the digestive system of a cow or a horse and still be viable in the soil. So, if you're using fresh manure, it's a good way to bring in weed seeds. Especially, I always say, if you're using horse manure, you got a good chance of bringing in musk thistle, because that big flower head on musk thistle, horses will eat that like candy. They really love that, and so it passes through their system, and you add it to your garden if you're using horse manure. So use composted manure if you're using manure, or aged, not fresh. So some other things that we can do: crop rotation, weeding. We've talked about weeding now, in terms of whether you decide to pull or cut it off. It should be, your annuals and biennials, you can weed those, you can pull them. Your perennials, a lot of them, you're not going to want to try and pull them out. You're just going to want to cut them off at the surface. Bed planting is really more about convenience in terms of managing weeds. Not that it's any magic, in terms of weed control. It's just they're in beds they're easy to access, easy to manage. So that helps you with your weeds. The one minus to bed planting that the Wyoming Master Gardener book talks about is a lot of times in our beds we plant so thick because we have this defined space and we want to use it all up, and we plant the plants we want thick enough that they start competing against each other just like weeds. So just think about that in your beds. So I said at the first, and I really believe this, bark is really one of your best friends, especially in your woody plant areas. Bark as a mulch works really great. And then you need about 3 to 4 inches for good weed suppression. A lot of people will put a weed barrier first and then put their bark. So I'd encourage you not to do that. I'd encourage you to use a little more bark and not use a weed barrier. The reason being is that bark breaks down and returns to soil as organic matter. And so, allowing that process to work will benefit your soil in multiple ways. You'll control weeds and add organic matter. If you put the weed barrier down first, then the organic matter can't return to the soil. So newspaper or cardboard, underneath it will break down at the same time, and so you can use that. After it breaks down, you're sort of back to the same starting level as if you didn't use it, and just started with bark. So, but people will use that, especially in new areas where they really want to try and control weeds. So that's a strategy people use. In terms of bark versus other mulches, certainly for weed control, you can use other mulches. You can use rock, or you can use the recycled tire sort of rubber mulches. The reason I like bark the best is bark actually keeps your soil temperatures cooler and reduces water use, where rock actually heats up your soil temperatures and uses more water. So if you're using rock mulches around your woody landscapes, you're probably going to use more water when you do that. So that's why I like the bark the best anyway for weed control. Certainly, we're familiar with putting plastic down between our rows and stuff in vegetable gardens too. So when we get to chemical control, we'll talk about some effective ones. It's important to take the proper safety precautions. Again, it's not chapter 19 in your book. 17 is pesticides. And then the big question, what are some chemicals I can use? So when you go to the store, you're assaulted with this image, right? All these products, all these brand names, and you're thinking, wow, there's like 30 products on the shelf there. What do I do with all those? Well, I want you to start looking at active ingredient statements, and I'm going to show you where to find those on the label. Because of all those products that are up there, I think there's probably only 4 or 5 chemicals at the most represented there in terms of active ingredients. So a lot of it's just marketing and imaging, and once you can sort through that, you can really save yourself a lot of money and be more effective in your weed control. So I'm going to talk about 3 just of the most common ones you would see up there in terms of weed control, and some issues to think about. So 2,4-D and dicamba, they would be the most common in your broadleaf weed control products. They are systemics. They both control broadleafs, and they do not damage grass as long as you're doing it properly. So if you have a 2,4-D product and you take your gallon sprayer and you look at this, and you've kind of looked at the label, and you're trying to figure out how much to put in, and finally you just give up, and you kind of go like this into your tank, and then you look at your tank and you're thinking, I don't know if there's enough in there, so you kind of do this number. You can kill your grass with a broadleaf weed killer if you do that. So 2,4-D will damage grass and can kill it even at a high enough level, but you'll see this in lawns. Sometimes it's a fertilizer issue, but you'll also see it with 2,4-D, where if somebody's mixed 2,4-D too thick and then they've overlapped when they've been spraying, and you'll see brown streaks in lawns where the 2,4-D has set that lawn back. So you got to mix things at the right level, the level that the label tells you to, and it'll work a lot better than if you do it the other way. So a couple other things with the 2,4-D. You do want to do it outside of the drip line, especially with dicamba. Dicamba is even harder on woody plants, so you want to stay outside of the drip line of trees to protect them. If you haven't necessarily been watering properly before and you've got tree roots coming up to the surface, you have to be really careful with these products, because they can get into your tree roots and damage your trees. So 2,4-D doesn't have a lot of movement in the soil, so you're okay, or you're fairly safe if you've been watering correctly, but still it's really best to stay outside of the drip line. So the main chemical in most of your weed and feed products is 2,4-D as well. The good news is it's at such a light rate that it doesn't damage your trees all that much. The bad news is doesn't work all that well either. I mean, I don't recommend using weed and feed all that much. I would rather use the right chemical and then the right fertilizer as a separate tool. But you can damage your woody landscapes with weed and feed if you put it on at too thick of a rate, and if conditions are just right. So, I teach this class. I tell my parents these things, but like 3 years ago, my dad really set back my mom's perennial area because he got a little crazy with the weed and feed fertilizer and got a bunch of it in the perennials and damaged them pretty good. So you can do that even with just weed and feed. It's one of the things when I go out and do house calls, if I'm going out to look at a tree that's got something wrong with it and the homeowner can't figure it out, first thing I start looking for when I walk out into the lawn is to see if I see any weeds in the lawn. If I see absolutely no weeds in that lawn, it's one of the warning signals that I'll think about in terms of what might be going on with that tree, because I know that if there are absolutely no weeds in your lawn, then you've been applying chemicals at a fairly good rate to being fairly aggressive, right? So then the other most common one, the one that, I've been using Roundup as a term, but there's other products that have glyphosate in it, is glyphosate. It's a systemic also in terms of once it contacts that plant, it will go through to the root system and kill the plant. It is non-selective, so whatever plant you put it on, it's going to have activity on that plant. The good news about Roundup, though, or glyphosate is it is deactivated at soil contact. So there is no soil activity. So you can spray right up to a tree, or you can spray right up to your perennials if you're trying to control some different things. So you can be fairly precise with it in that way, in that it only is active on the plants that it touches, but it it kills anything it touches. So be careful with that. The other thing is, I said that, and I have to be careful the way I say it. When I said there's no soil activity, that's not to say that there's no soil residue of Roundup. So at one point we thought Roundup didn't stay in the soil, but there's a lot of evidence that would suggest that it'll stay in the soil for a couple of years. So, if you're using it to control some weeds in like a vegetable garden or something, and you're worried, if you're worried about being able to control the weeds, and then once they die, rototilling and replanting, you don't have to worry about that. There's no activity with Roundup once it's been in the soil. You can replant and things will come up. But if you're concerned about consuming chemical residues, then you do need to worry about it, because the residue will reside in the soil. So that's the difference there in terms of residue versus action. So the question was, how long does it have to stay on the leaves to actually get sucked up? It depends on the formulation, depends on the product. It'll tell you on the label how long you have to have before it gets wet, but you definitely need some time there. But it's dependent on the formulation. So glyphosate works really good for that kind of thing, because you don't have activity in the soil afterwards, so you can kill that lawn off and then come back in 4 or 5 days later and start over. All right, this is my little side. I take a little break from weeds and I do a selfish marketing plug here. So I'm an author on this book. It's called Scrappy Trees, Raw and Exposed. We just got this out with the university. So out in Cheyenne, Wyoming, there was a research center there that was operating from the 1920s through the 50s, and they were looking at trees of interest and trying to select trees and different varieties, doing a lot of research on trees. In the 50s, the funding ran out, and they basically abandoned all the trees at the research center, forgot about them, left them there. So in 2000, people started thinking, wow, those are some cool trees out there. I wonder what those are, And so people had gone out there. Now there's plaques around all of these trees to tell you what the tree is, when it was planted. They went back and researched that information and found out. So we did a bulletin in 2007 and went and took pictures of all these. We just got the bulletin published this year. But it has all of these trees, and the reason I call it raw and exposed is because they haven't been pruned, they haven't been taken care of, they haven't been watered other than, nature's way of watering them. But these trees have lasted there 60 years after the project, and the pictures are these trees 60 years later, in a fairly harsh environment with low precip. So, they're trees that should be of interest to gardeners in terms of incorporating them into their landscape. One of the first companies was Fort Collins Wholesale Nursery. Sort of saw the value and went up there and started propagating these trees. But they're being propagated by quite a few different nurseries. Ton Bettis was one of the reviewers of this publication, and he said that there are a lot of them that are available here in Utah. So This is my little marketing ploy. But there's some of those trees that you'll look at and you go, that's an ugly tree because it hasn't been pruned or anything. But you kind of got to use your imagination and think about what it would look like if it was trained. And there's some of them that are still awful pretty even though they haven't had anything. So this was the one that I fell in love with. This is a Russian hawthorn. I've planted it in my yard and it's doing really well. So we're going to finish off with understanding pesticides, and we'll go through the label and some information about them. Really, this is the easiest section I teach because no matter what question you ask me, the answer I can give you is read the label first and it'll tell you. I'll give you answers too. I won't just tell you that, but I'll probably end every answer with, but if you read the label, you'll find it in there. So read the label first as the take-home message of this last 20 or 30 minutes of presentation. And I've been kind of throwing out terms already about pesticides and herbicides. Pesticide is the overall arching statement, and just like breeds of dogs, there's lots of different breeds of pesticides. So there's insecticides, herbicides, rodenticides, molluscicides. Those are all part of the pesticide family. And so when we talk about labeling and regulations and understanding the label, we use the term pesticide, but it applies to everything. So you want to read the label before you buy the product, before you store the product, before you mix the product, before you dispose of it. So I've got two products here. One is Ultra Kill Weed and Grass Killer. This one's Roundup Weed and Grass Killer. Okay, now you got to be honest. Which one do you usually go and buy and take off the shelf? Roundup, right? So this is why I want you to start looking at ingredient statements. This Roundup contains 18% glyphosate. That's the active ingredient. And there's 16 fluid ounces in this container. This Weed and Grass Killer contains 25% glyphosate. And there's 32 ounces in this container. I paid the same amount for these two containers. So I got twice as much in this one, plus the chemical was at a significantly higher rate than this one. Glyphosate is what does the killing. It's not anything. It's not anything else. I'll be a little honest with you too. In terms of Roundup, does have 0.7% diquat dibromide in it, and this one doesn't have diquat dibromide. Does anybody know what diquat dibromide does to plants? It turns them brown. So you think you've killed that plant. So it turns them brown almost immediately. It's that immediate gratification. It tells you get an instant kill. They advertise it on commercials. Instant kill. It's just the diquat dibromide. And diquat will kill plants if you put it at a high enough rate. But at the rate in here, it just browns the plants. If it was only diquat you used, that plant would recover from it and be okay. So Roundup gives you instant gratification. This one doesn't. If you're willing to pay for instant gratification, that's fine. I don't care which one you buy. Then the only other slight differences companies would argue that makes their products different is there are inert ingredients that don't have to be listed, and those are things like surfactants and stickers and that kind of stuff that they would argue that our formulation's better than your formulation. It's pretty tough to really convince me of how much difference there is in the inert ingredient formulation. So I buy chemicals based on the active ingredient statement. All right, with these two products, there's something else I want to cover in terms of storing pesticide. A lot of glyphosate products will say on the label, do not store below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you've got glyphosate products out in your shed and they have frozen multiple times over the winter, there is a good chance that they are severely they're not near as active as they were before that. So it significantly reduces the activity level if they say do not store below 32 degrees and they freeze. So not all formulations say that. Some formulations are okay to freeze, so you have to read your label to make sure of that. But if it does say that, you've got to take precautions with your chemicals so you're not freezing them, because then you significantly reduce the activity, then you go out and spray with it the next year. It doesn't work. But even worse than that is you create chemical resistance in your plants because they're able to overcome that low dose of chemical, and then it takes a bigger dose of chemical to do that, to control that plant later. If it doesn't say it on the label, then it's probably okay to freeze. So, yeah. Like most 2,4-D products, they can be frozen, and it's not an issue. But glyphosate's a little more volatile in terms of freezing. So the other thing in terms of temperature you want to pay attention to on chemicals, it's not as big a deal on glyphosate actually as it is on like a 2,4-D product, is chemicals will volatilize at different temperatures. So certainly above 80 degrees, a lot of our chemicals will volatilize, and what that means is it becomes a very fine mist, and even a light breeze will carry that chemical over to your neighbor's yard and kill their trees. So, you know, you want to make sure you read on the label too the maximum temperature you can spray at, because chemical can volatilize and drift quite easily.